All right, ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special guest. If you have not seen this man on your Instagram timeline, if you have not seen this man on Tennis Channel, you're not following tennis. Joel's the director in Coronado, in San Diego, and he's probably one of the most influential, I would say, coaches on the internet. If correct me if I'm wrong or if I'm tooting your horn, but I wanted to have Joel on to talk about something very specific. But Joel, how are you? Thank you so much for joining us today.
Bill, thanks for having me. That's way too kind with the intro, man. But thank you for having
No, and I appreciate you taking time out of your day. I know East Coast, West Coast, Coast time.
me.
It's see, we're already here. It's already past 5 p.m. for me. But we appreciate him being on here because there's been a lot of stuff going around about how recently there has not been ever a non one-handed backhand player in the top 10. And one of the things I wanted to bring you on, and the main thing I wanted to bring Joel on to talk about is the one-handed backhand. I have one. Joel, I know you can do both, but which one do you prefer?
Nowadays, definitely the one. When you're coaching, very easy to hit a one.
Yes. And Tsitsipas dropped out of the top 10, which was the first time, I believe, ever in the ATP history that a one-handed backhand is not in the top 10 rankings.
Yep.
And Joel, when you hear something like that and something that's been so pivotal, what do you think as a tennis fan and a tennis coach? Because there's two different ways of looking at this.
Yeah. As a fan, it's definitely sad to see the numbers so low. I think
Hmm.
looking at some of the numbers today, I was reading Chris Clary's article.
Yeah.
He's a great tennis, lives here in Coronado, and here just to go through some of the stats on this. In the ATP right now, there are 11 players in the top 100, which
Hmm.
is it's crazy. It gets even worse for the WTA. There are no players in the top 50 with a single-handed backhand, and there's only 3 in the top 100. And even worse, 11 women in the top 500 have single-handed backhands. So this is
I
from
didn't
Chris.
know that last one. The last one's
2%,
shocking.
2%, top 500. And I mean, there are reasons for it. I think number one, it's so hard to get through juniors with a one-handed backhand. You got to,
Okay.
you have to be an incredible mover at an early age. You have to negate all the players that are going to exploit you when the ball is high and wide.
Hmm.
And you can't rely on a slice. These are things that everyone knows have gone through juniors. You just play so many moonballers. That's
Yeah.
like the barrier of getting past juniors is like, can you get through the moonballers? And
Yeah,
if you ever
absolutely.
like, it's tough. So I know when I started playing, I started with a one-handed backhand, and I ended up making the change to two just purely because of the strength above the shoulder. Um,
Okay.
and in saying that, there are advantages that one-handers have. So
Hmm.
pros and cons. I think if you're the type of player that looks to use a one-hander, I think as a junior and as a starting very early, you have to have a long-term vision of
Hmm.
that stroke, and it's mostly transitional. That's where the
Yeah.
big advantage. There's a big disadvantage in grip changes on return of serve. You have to make a grip change unless you're chipping it. If you watch Stan Wawrinka, he does a lot of chipping, which leaves you vulnerable to the third ball of the rally or a
Hmm.
serve and volley. Anyone does that anymore.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, there are pros and cons, but it's just
It
hard. So
it's one of those because I actually did the opposite. When I was a junior, when I was 13, I switched to a one-hander
okay,
because two hands was just very awkward for me. And even though I golf lefty and play swing a baseball bat lefty, I'm right dominant right hand.
okay,
But for me, that feels more natural. But every time I play tennis, it just my left arm wouldn't go through. And I think that's because the strength in my left arm was not even close to what my right arm was. So I switched to the one hander. And as much as I love my one hander, I've always said, like, if you had a choice, like, I don't know what I would choose now
yeah,
because the one hander I like because of the versatility. And I think it offers a lot more variety on demand versus a two hander, but that's just my opinion. And I think from a perspective of junior players, I was reading, who was I reading? I was reading from a podcast transcript, and they were talking about how, as a junior, people want to see that instant success with the kids. So, in
Yep.
order to take time to develop a one hander, it's probably going to take twice as much effort just to get the kid to develop the footwork, technique, grip, everything like that to achieve a good one hander in those scenarios, because that's not what is going to really help them prevail against the other kids, especially when you play juniors that bomb balls or moon ball them, like you said,
Yep.
all the time.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's also the same reason you're not seeing as many players on tour coming forward and transitioning forward. That's another thing where you have to do that a lot through juniors, and you have to lose a lot doing that to develop the instinct. Okay, that's a bad angle to approach on, or that is, I've got to close out here and gamble on a pass volley. So there's lots of things where you have to have a long-term view, and you have easier, earlier success with a two-hander. It's also a matter of, you're coaching a group. If I've got 6-8 kids on the court, I'm going to go with a two-hander. It's so much easier for them to stay connected when you take the racket back by just turning away from the net, keeping two hands racket. It's all connected. It's all stable. And you do that in groups. It's very hard to teach a one-hander. It's, I think you have to have specific hands-on training with almost a coach. And that's going to be almost like a request from somebody. If somebody played tennis before, I'm going to start them in a two-hander so that they can just enjoy the game, because it's so hard high on the backhand. But if it was a specific request from someone, hey, my son's going to be tall, he's an athlete, he likes coming forward, then maybe you think, all right, well, he might be better off with a one-hander because the hitting shoulders in front, transition towards the net. You can defend the body. You don't have to run around everything as much. So I don't know. There's very hard to get through the suck as a junior when the ball's up high on the shoulder consistently.
Oh yeah, and I think that's what keeps people away from it as well, because they see big serves, they see the moon ballers. Like, how do you defend against that with a one-hander? Do you take it short off the rise, or do you take a step back and try to hit through it? Because even if you try to hit through it, it's not going to be the same as a ball that's coming straight at you with pace. And to have kids take time, and I'm going to use an example from like years ago when I first started teaching, is like when kids start hitting a backhand, or they always release with one hand. If they keep doing that, maybe I'll have some incentive to like try finishing like this and see where it goes from there. But you can't teach someone from the ground up how to hit a one-handed backhand without teaching a two-handed first.
Yeah, I mean, you still take the racket back with two hands. It's just the higher on the throat than the grip. It's very, very. It's what happens in the drop. Do you drop and then release when the racket head is under your hitting hand, or do you keep connected? They're very, very similar in a lot of ways, but it's like the biggest change is the hitting shoulders in front on a single hander, and the double hander, the hitting shoulders is the back shoulder. So if you can imagine running laterally for a backhand, once the ball gets behind your lead shoulder as a single hander, you have to slice it. The two-hander, they have that left hand, they can sort of get that left hand behind them and keep the ball in front, so they don't necessarily have to go to the slice. So that is one of the disadvantages when the ball is wide and high, and tennis is particularly lateral sport in singles. 70% of the movement lateral. And when you play someone with a single hander, you look down the other end of the warm up, you go, all right, single hander, I'm going to try and exploit this right away by getting the ball up out wide. I want to make him slide, float it. And you immediately have a game plan against a single hander in your mind, even before you step out on the court.
Which hurts, which personally hurts. But for me, for understanding that too, when you just said lateral, one thing that comes to mind when you say lateral too is for doubles, and it kind of evolves into like the game today. It evolves of like how people move on court, how the game has changed, how there are not that many serve and volleyers. But if we look at serve and volleyers, especially, and I'm going to go back to when I first started talking is doubles, Salisbury and Ram both have one-handers. You see a lot more one-handed players at least in my opinion, in the doubles game than you would singles, and maybe because that's not exploited as much and they get to hide it a lot more and their reflexes at the net cover it. But what would you say for the biggest difference of having, or what would you say about that with doubles, with
Yeah,
people having more one-handers in doubles than singles?
I think maybe the return of serve, the deficiency of a single hander is maybe negated, because in doubles primarily the serves are coming down the tee and at the body.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if I'm returning at a pro doubles level, I know most of the time the server is going to be going down the tee or at the body so that he can get his net player the first ball to poach. So
Yeah.
I can sort of that. So maybe I'm sitting on that inside grip more, and I don't have to make a decision as much.
Mm-hmm.
When the ball's in front of you, you know, when the ball is in front of you, you can go forward on a single hander.
Yeah.
I can hit like out in front of me between my hips and go forward. I can also defend the body serve a little bit better. So there are definitely advantages. But being able to take that ball out in front early and get on the net. And then it also probably has a lot to do with better backhand volleys and better volleys in general. You look at historically players with single handers are just really good transitional players. They have solid volleys, especially volleys. You know,
go ahead.
Better Flavor and Navratilova.
Yeah.
Graf, you know, I mean, didn't transition as much, but definitely able to volley and more comfortable with the left hand up the road.
Henin had a good volley, right?
I think I mean, it's one of those ones where I think she finished because the quality of the mid-court ball was so solid, you know?
Yeah,
like, sort of
that's true.
Rafa's percentages at the net are insane because he's coming in behind an amazing forehand that usually finishes it, and if it doesn't, it's a gimme volley.
Yeah, it's true. And I think for a lot of the one-handers too, and I kind of want to go back to that junior development too, is when was the last time you taught a one-handed backhand? Probably like specifically.
I
or
would
intentionally.
say a year. Well, actually, no, the last 6 months, but it's from a player that has come in with a one-hander.
Okay. So when was the last time you taught someone with a ground up one-hander?
From scratch, initially at my discretion, never.
Really?
I've never been like, let's experiment and make this player a single hander. I think there are so many things that go into it. I mean, if you probably then even have to go as far as to look at the parents genetically. If you're going to go down that line and go, okay, yeah, your dad's about 5'3" and your mum's about 5 foot, probably single-handed might not be the go here.
Okay.
You know, I think
it's realistic. It's realistic.
I think so. I mean, like if I'm thinking, well, what type of player am I trying to develop? Like an amazing generational talent that's, you know, stands out from the other grinders of the baseline, and we're trying to go the other. Everyone's looking one way, we're trying to go the other way and differentiate, transition, and come into the net, being offensive and sticking close to the baseline. I think the one-hander has value, but if you're just teaching, like, oh, okay, I want this kid to enjoy tennis and not want after the 7th moon ball high to the outside. Maybe go with a two-hander, let him have a little bit of test. Maybe we change it later.
Yeah.
But I've never picked a scratch beginner and been like, all right, this is one-hander for you.
Wow. That's fascinating to me, because I'm trying to think, like, it's so hard.
Right away, you can have some success with it. It's a very easy stage. Everything is so connected. It's in a lot of ways, it's hard to go wrong with the two-hand. One-hander can really go wrong. I mean, you got the wrong grip, you're really in trouble. If you don't have an Eastern backhand grip as a one-hander, you're in trouble. You can get away with some funky grips as a two-hander and still be okay.
It's true, and especially the way, like, if we look at the modern one-handed backhand versus the traditional, if we took the Lendls, McEnroes, like, Federer even was, or Grigor is like the last of the traditional one-handed backhand, and compare it to a Wawrinka team, maybe even a Kohlschreiber too. I can't believe I just brought up that name too. Like, if you look at some of these one-handed backhand players with a modern backhand, it's not a full topspin, it's a slap. It's the way they come across their body, because that's the only way they can generate that flat spin off of it. and they can never do it above their shoulder. It always has to be below the shoulder and swing through. Like you said, you have to lean in with that right shoulder. There's no way, at least from a traditionalist standpoint, that kind of one-handed backhand will be taught.
It is funny though, because really, essentially, two-hander, one-hander, it doesn't matter. The backhand is a tool, and it's generally never the tool that does the most damage. I mean, Wawrinka's plus minus, and I went back a long time ago, and I was having a debate with somebody, I forget who it was, and they were like, "Oh, but Wawrinka's backhand is his better shot," and I was like,
Yeah.
"No, it's like he does his damage with his forehand." So I went and charted the plus minuses on all of his finals, where he one player in the world. And he was always in the negatives on the backhand, and he was always in the positives on the forehand. And plus
because
minus
he sets it up.
Yeah, but for everybody who's listening, plus minus means anytime somebody hits a forehand winner, you give them a point. Anytime someone makes a forehand error, you give them a point, and you note the difference. So you do not want to be negative very much on a backhand, because the backhand is not the side you do the most damage with.
Yeah.
And the forehand, you might make a ton of errors on the forehand, but you're bound to make a ton more winners. So you're generally in the pot. And that's sort of the difference. It's just a tool. And I think people look at a Wawrinka and go, "Oh, he'll hit a backhand winner from anywhere." But really, it's better than the opponent's backhand generally by a lot. And that's the difference. So that's why you go, "Oh, that's amazing, amazing shot."
I think it's because more of how it looks. And that's where a lot of people get into the debate of, does it look cooler? Yeah, honestly, depending on who you're watching, the one-hander definitely looks cooler than most two-handed backhands on tour, and probably is more effective than most of the two-handers on tour. But again, going back to your plus-minus situation, like, you have to look at the numbers in that sense of, same with Federer. Like, Federer was able to utilize his backhand because he was able to set it up for the rest of his shots and the rest of his points. Whether or not Federer had honestly, he does probably have the prettiest backhand of all time, but he used it to develop the rest of his game rather than vice versa.
Yeah, it's a compliment. It's not the main dish from the back of the court by any means. But using the variety, using the slice. I mean, he used a slice to bring somebody in to hurt them on the next ball. But that's a tool. He's not winning it with the slice. And the slice backhand is another one. It's not a winning shot. It's a setup ball.
Yeah.
But talking about backhands that do damage, like, I don't know if you ever watched Nicholas Basilashvili hit a backhand.
His is like an absolute ripper.
So I was at Indian Wells, and I was sitting there with my wife. She doesn't watch any tennis. She doesn't know anything about tennis. So it's nice. She's not in my ear. I'm just watching
join the club.
Yeah. And so we're just watching Basilashvili absolutely smash two-handed backhands, leaning backwards in the middle of the court, finding angle against Taylor Fritz. And I closed my eyes for a little bit, and I was just listening to the sound of it. And I couldn't tell if it was a forehand or a backhand from either player. You could tell when Taylor Fritz hit a backhand because it sounded different. But when you hear Basilashvili hit the backhand, it sounded like he was just clubbing a forehand. So it was, but the reason I bring that up is that it's very rare to find somebody who can do a lot of damage with a backhand from behind the baseline. And most of the single-handers do very well because they maintain a strong baseline position. And that's when a single-hander is most dangerous. And if you take that to juniors, if a junior with a single-hander plays too far behind the baseline, it's very easy for the ball to get up high and to completely take them out of the baseline exchange. Their only way back is to try and run around it. So that's when the backhand gets weaker, the forehand gets stronger. They have a huge deficit between those two. So it's another thing is court positioning with a single-hander. It needs to be maintained to be effective.
Who do you think, in your opinion, for a one-handed backhand had the most effective? And probably this off the top of your head. Probably don't, but maybe you do. Who had the best plus minus for a one-handed backhand, you think? If you were to guess.
One-hander. I mean, you might have a look at someone like Tommy Haas.
Oh, that would be
great. Like
I forgot about Tommy Haas. How could I forget about Tommy Haas?
Can't forget about Tommy Haas. When you look at Tommy Haas's one-hander, it's so clean and pure, like it's repeatable, but it's not a stroke that would break down at all. So I think that's a player where you look at, he's not necessarily doing the damage. So he's not going to go deep into the negatives on the minus because he's not trying to win the point with that shot. Probably a little bit like how Djokovic uses his backhand.
Yeah.
He can keep it cross court, but he's not generally hitting the winners with that stroke unless he's really short in the court.
Mm-hmm. And
but I think to me, that's what makes a single-hander really dangerous. Like, think about when players play Wawrinka. You typically sort of have to play a Stan Wawrinka, even in the ad court exchanges, you typically have to recover closer to the center, the hash mark, because of his ability to redirect at will up the line.
Yeah.
So if he can pull the trigger and just go up the line at will and change the whole arrangement of the rally at any moment, I've got to keep recovering. So even play great inside-out forehands that are trying to get ahead in the rally against him, they have to respect that at all times. Otherwise, he can really just change the rally quickly.
We talk about the advantages, and you've been mentioning some great points with the one-handers, and I feel like it's funny when from 1970 to 1990, 60% of Grand Slams were won by one-handers, and that's just the generation of people being taught the one-hander and people playing with more one-handers than not.
Yep.
I'm just surprised that in the women's game there aren't more one-handers, because I feel like the variety, and Ash Barty comes to mind for some reason when she uses her slice effectively. Like, that was one of the things that I admired about Barty's game, is just the way she was able to do that and so casually to move the court up and back, not just side to side, especially for the women's tour. Like, that to me is fantastic. So I'm surprised that there hasn't been more one-handers on the women's side, because I think the last one-handed woman to win a major was Schiavone at the French.
So
right?
Yeah, I think that's right.
So I'm surprised that when we talk about the variety and what it has to offer, why you wouldn't want to teach a girl to hit a one-hander.
The slice and the backspin is the only way you can bring someone forward, right? You're not going to hit a short ball. That would be suicide. So using the slice to bring them forward is the only way you can do it. Ash Barty was like a copy paste of maybe Steffi Graf, only Barty moved forward more.
Yeah.
And if you can't slice back, it's a real problem. I mean, you have to get under the ball and you have to lift it. You can't hit the ball very hard because you've got to clear the net.
Yeah.
And that ball's up again for a player to run around it. Exactly. Or, line. I think a lot of like, what did you say, 60% from what time to what time again?
So on the men's tour, from what I've been told, is 1970 to 1990, 60% of Grand Slams were won by one-handed players.
Yeah, you have a lot of transitional guys though, right? You have
it's a lot of serve and volley, isn't it?
Serve and volley, and I think that goes with the times. I think with the slowing down of the courts across all surface, I don't know if you've seen that graph in the last year, where it shows you from the surfaces sort of homogenizing over the last 20 years. Even the grass is slow, and they're all very similar in terms of surface speed, and that just makes the reward of going forward, it's not as beneficial. When they had indoor carpet tournaments that were fast as hell, I mean, being able to take that ball and go to the net, not stay back and get beaten by the bounce, was really important. And so I think that's changed a little bit too with the racket head sizes, making it, you get more value out of a return of serve.
Yeah,
it's
a lot of factors, and I think
but if you're not being, like, number one, if kids aren't seeing it at the top of the game, they're not going to replicate it. You need to see something at the top of the game and go, oh, I want to be like Federer. There's so many kids who wanted to be like Federer or Sampras or whoever's got the shot at the time, and then be able to be taught it.
Yeah.
But if you have a kid that comes in and they don't know anything about tennis, and you give them the option, do you want to be a one-hander or a two-hander? They're not going to know what's better. They don't even know the pros and cons.
Yeah.
So it's in for them, and I think that's But you can still develop a single hander later if you start with
Mhm.
two.
And for and I hate to ask this because it just sounds like such a bad question, but was Federer's greatness with a one-hander a fad for people to start developing one-handed backhands?
You mean, did people look at that and it was like, oh, let's start hitting one-handers?
Yeah.
I think it was probably people were definitely trying it, and I think
Okay.
maybe it's like the results probably don't come right away, so they go, all right, no, Nadal or Djokovic is my guy now. I feel like it might be one of those situations where people try it, and then as you watch a lot of tennis as a kid, you try different things, maybe it doesn't work for you, but the barrier to entry, it's a long and hard road to climb, especially when you're a young kid, you haven't developed any strength, you probably haven't hit puberty yet. So how are you going to deal with everything above the shoulder? You got to get through
Yeah.
all of it. Then when your strength kicks in, when your timing gets better, when you're experienced with those high balls, you know how to negate them, then it becomes beneficial. But it takes a long time to get through that before it really starts to pay off, I feel like.
Mhm. And it's funny that you say that too. It's because Federer even said in 2018 that I don't think I would teach my kids if I had the choice to teach my kids a one-hander or two-hander in tennis. He said two-hander, which hurts. Again, feel personally attacked, but it's true. It just seems like the more stable shot, and we're definitely going to have Tsitsipas back into the top 10. And Dimitrov, well, if Dimitrov keeps playing the way he does this year, especially at the tail end of last year, he's probably going to come back into the top 10.
Yep.
But in terms of younger talent,
Yeah. It's tough.
Chapo is the only one that I can think of that's under 25
I
or
think
is 25 or he's
he's
still
like 100
younger.
world right now. He's young, but I think he's 127 in the world right now.
He's been injured, but if I was to think of like the next good one-hander, oh my God, am I really thinking of this?
It's
I'm
well,
currently looking it up.
somebody direct messaged me on Instagram when I was talking about this yesterday briefly on my story, and they said they looked at it and they said that on the guys' side, and I'm sure on the girls' side too, there are no juniors in the top 30 in the world that have a single hander. And when you look at that sample size and you
Yeah,
realize, okay, those 30, how many are going to be like notable pros? Like what
yeah,
percentage? Not very high.
yeah,
Um, so then you're like, all right, well, it might have some like flashbacks where you have an amazing standout junior that does something really
yeah.
well. It's going to have to be like all of a sudden this guy is like a specialist and he's doing well because of that. Sort of like what Maxime Cressy does with serve and volley.
Yeah. And I was mention that to you as well because we talked about it earlier of how special or like how you get away with it with doubles players and with serve and volley. You don't really need that one hand, like that two-handed or one-handed backhand powerhouse because you're taking away that opportunity from your opponent. And also names that I forgot to mention with one-handers: Eubanks,
Yeah.
Musetti, Dan Evans, um,
Only Dan
Kava-
Evans sliced heaps. He watch him chip so much.
he barely uses his topspin. It's kind of like a how I saw Grigor for a while. He'll use his slice up until like a necessary needs to hit a passing shot.
Yep.
But Kovacevic is another one that's 91 in the world right now. He's 25 that has such a nice one-hander. And you see guys like this and you're thinking like how like there's hope, but
Yeah.
there's like there's something pulling against it because of everything else that happens when it comes to the one-hander. And from juniors to pros, would you say that one-handers will go extinct or no?
I think there'll always be someone that looks at it and goes, I want to do that.
Yeah.
They get to the very, very top. I don't know. I mean, knowing the advantage that a two-hander has on return, because like statistically, the returner serve is the most missed shot in tennis. The most common rally length in tennis is one shot. So the serve return doesn't come back. People forget that when they play a match because they remember the long rallies. They remember the forehand winners and the dumb errors. But they don't remember all the dumb missed returns they didn't get back in play.
Yeah.
So there's that, and then there's also the fact that I think maybe in the future you're going to see players that will use two hands as a return, and then potentially the one hand for more freedom going forward.
Oh.
You know, there's possibility for that.
Okay.
Another side tangent, but you might see players that have like a jack sock Western grip on the forehand change their grip on the return, which some players do just for the return, purely for the return. Negate the disadvantage on the return, make the return in, maybe from there free up with the single hander. There'd be nothing wrong with that.
Okay. I don't mind that either. And it reminds me of Songa when he would like do that one-handed backhand flick, which I feel like just a little brush up, which I think kind of goes inside that point of yours too, of like they can change it, but they won't have to as much if they stick to one or the other. And
sure.
Joel, I can't thank you enough for joining us today. I'm glad it worked out.
Yeah.
Guys, if you're not following Joel, you're probably not following me. So make sure you're following Joel. His Instagram's down in the description below. Make sure to check out his tips. His content is unbelievable. I use it to teach myself, but I can't thank him enough for being here. Joel, what's the next? Joel? Shut the